Professor Mégret is an associate professor of law at McGill University. In March 2015, he made a William Dawson Scholar by McGill. He held the Canada Research Chair on Law of Human Rights and Legal Pluralism from 2006 to 2015. He was promoted to full professor in 2019. His interests include international criminal justice, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, the law of international organizations, transitional justice, criminal law, and general international law. So I'd like to welcome Professor Mégret.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Good morning to all. It's a great pleasure to be back in this institution. I had an interesting conversation pretty much a year ago. I checked; it was almost day for day. And I think this is an important event. I think we can always have more conversations about genocide, remembering genocide, but also thinking critically about what genocide is, what it means, why it happens, and what can be done ideally to prevent further genocides. There's something dispiriting about the fact that this is a conversation that we're still having despite the 20th century, despite all of the deaths, the untold suffering that has occurred over the last centuries, in fact, not just the 20th century. But the reality is that genocide is a sort of ongoing phenomenon, that there are genocides happening in our midst, but also genocidal attempts, genocidal thoughts, genocidal projects. And I think perhaps the only risk of focusing on genocide is you focus on the exceptional and the kind of the pathological and sort of the mega event, right? And what I want to stress today is that, and if you really want to make the most of these moments of reflection, it's to sort of, what you want to do is connect genocide to a lot of ordinary human rights violations. There's a sort of continuum between the sort of mass killing of entire groups and discrimination, hate speech, persecution of minorities, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, genocide, right? So I think we look at the exceptional, we look at the genocide also as a way to think about how we get to a genocide, and how, genocides are often prepared long in advance. I'm going to be talking for about half an hour, 45 minutes. Feel free to interrupt me. I may ask you a few questions if I'm, searching for thoughts. I'll want to know your opinion on some of these issues. Don't hesitate to interrupt me if there's, you sort of a historical background to what I'm talking about is not very clear to you. We'll take things slowly. I should say I'm a lawyer by training, and that's how I was introduced by Marlene. So I have a bit of professional deformation as a result, right? But now I'm not going to give you a lawyer's view exactly, or we're not going to get too technical. But there's an interesting side question behind all of this, I think, which is, to what extent is this a legal issue? To what extent is it a political issue? To what extent is it a moral issue? Does it matter that we have a legal definition of genocide in the 1948 Genocide Convention, the foundational genocide treaty? Is that definition maybe part of a problem sometimes? Should we be expanding it? Should it be narrower? We could have genocide as an idea, indeed we have genocide as an idea without necessarily genocide convention, right? Historians work on genocide, they're not actually applying necessarily the genocide definition, at least the way lawyers would. But there's also appeal to genocide being prohibited by the law. What might be the advantages? Why invest? Why would we want genocide to be a legal concept? Yep. Yeah. So a very good point. So obviously you can't prosecute anyone if there isn't an instrument making this into a crime, right? If this was just a historian's or a scholar's conceit, then it would be very difficult to bring people to trial for it. So at least now, as a potential defendant, you're entitled to the offense already existing at the time you committed it. Otherwise, it would be a bit arbitrary if you were told, well, we hadn't thought of this at the time, but surprise, there's such a thing as genocide, and you were guilty of it, even though we hadn't sort of really given you notice that this was a crime. And that was one of the problems after the Second World War, was that we didn't have a Genocide Convention at Nuremberg, right? The Genocide Convention was adopted shortly thereafter, and so the senior Nazis in Nuremberg could be prosecuted. They could be prosecuted for aggression, for crimes against peace, for invading other countries. They could be prosecuted for war crimes, which by then had quite an established history, but they couldn't quite be prosecuted for genocide. There's a sort of intermediary category of crimes against humanity, but even that was a bit of a sort of creative, late invention that wasn't really grounded in international law. Why else would we want to, aside from holding individuals accountable, why would we want to have a genocide convention in an international treaty? Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. So it could be just moral stigma, but it helps that there's also a kind of legal stigma. And I suppose the difference between morality and law is that law tends to be binding, right? So, it's one thing to sort of point your finger at something and say, that's genocide and it's bad, but people might dismiss that as just a moral judgment, right? They say, well, that's your opinion, reasonable people can disagree about this, right? I'm not sure you would want to have that kind of reasonable disagreement with genocide. Nonetheless, you could have that disagreement at the margin, right? Not is genocide a good or a bad thing, but, what exactly is genocide? How broadly should we interpret it? If this was just a moral, political conversation that we were having, we could have it all day and all night and go on forever. We'd all disagree, right? So the advantage of the law stepping in, now the law is not, it's not a person, right? The law, when it comes to international law, is mostly states. Is you get the diplomats into a room and you get them to hammer out a definition, a deal, which one forces them to clarify for their state, not them personally, but for their state, what genocide really means, what it ought to mean, and then to kind of solemnly bind themselves to this treaty. Now, one of the beauties of binding yourself is you're not just binding yourself, you're binding yourself with and to others, right? So there's a sort of contractual element. Right? You're saying, well, I will not commit genocide because I'm now a state party to the Genocide Convention, but hey, you committed also, you ratified the treaty, I can now hold you accountable for violating the Genocide Convention, right? So even if potentially you as a state, as a government, commit genocide against your own people, that actually affects me as well as another state that, whose nationals are not directly affected, because it sort of weakens our collective commitment to making sure that genocide doesn't happen, right? So ideally, the Genocide Convention brings a certain clarity. It brings a form of legal stigma, but also the idea that, this is no longer negotiable. There's no longer just something that we discuss. This is something that we've committed to. It's a very solemn international obligation. Now, as you might suspect, simply because you have bound yourself under international law to not do something doesn't mean that you're never going to do it or that no one is going to do it. People make a lot of fuss about this and say, well, international law, is it really enforced? Where's the international police? There's no global world state. And there's some truth to that, right? But remember that domestically, within societies, a lot of crime goes unpunished, right? A lot of sexual assaults, for example, are never prosecuted in Canada. Almost sort of 9 out of 10, if not more, right? Now, but no one is saying that just because it's not prosecuted very often and people, those guilty are not found, that there is no law against sexual assault in Canada, right? So you can have a crime that's not systematically prosecuted, but for a variety of reasons, but about which no one entertains any doubt that it is indeed a crime, okay? So I think that's worth remembering. Yes, the cavalry isn't always coming when it comes to genocide. Yes, the International Criminal Court is a relatively late development. And yes, there are a lot of people who've committed grave international crimes who have done so with impunity, but some are prosecuted, and I think no state today would claim that genocide isn't a crime. And that is in itself a big victory, right? No state, so the typical pattern, right, is that states will say, we didn't do it, or you did it first, or it wasn't genocide, it was just a war, we were fighting, etc. So they're going to deny the genocide on the facts. They're going to say, well, or, maybe a more technical argument, this isn't a protected group. But none of them are going to say, yeah, we committed genocide, so what, right? I mean, this is simply, no longer part of international discourse. And in fact, if you were to be sort of quite transparent about the fact that you were committing genocide, you would probably be a prime target for prosecution, right? So there's a lot of refutation that one has indeed committed genocide. Okay, so I'm going to give you a bit of background. We're going to go through a few issues. Compared to last year, I'm going to emphasize the definitional issues a bit more because my talk is really on how do we avoid genocide. But you can't really discuss how to avoid genocide without a good understanding of what genocide is, right? So in order to avoid genocide, you need to make up your mind about what genocide is. And that in itself is part of a prevention work, right? It's like actually figuring out what you're pointing the finger at and what you want to devote resources to, etc. So this is really quite important. And it's all the more important that, the more stigmatized genocide becomes, the more it's likely to lead to the deployment of political, military, humanitarian resources, the more a stake there is in describing anything as genocide, right? And the more politicized the question is going to be, right? So people are going to disagree often quite vociferously about what is genocide and what isn't. Because this is no longer just a moot question, it isn't just a scholarly question, it's a question whose answer stands to have real-world consequences, okay? All right, so first, I think there's a lot of fuzziness around the term genocide. And I think one of the reasons, I don't want to be the typical lawyer saying, here, suggesting that only lawyers have it right. I actually, as a lawyer, think that we really want to have historians on board. We want to have political activists. We want to have different perspectives. But one thing is sure, the more people are involved in this conversation, coming from a kind of disciplinary specialties, the more confusion we're going to have potentially. So you see this a lot in the semantics of debating genocide, right? So massacres, that's not really a legal term, but it's a historical term that has, a certain connotation. We sort of, maybe it's more intuitive than genocide. We understand what a massacre is. Now, a massacre, might just be the killing of a group of people. As we'll see, genocide isn't necessarily about killing, and it's only certain groups of people. So massacre doesn't quite do it, right? Although there has certainly been genocidal massacres. Another very popular one, especially at the UN these days, is atrocities. So you see the word atrocities used quite a lot. Again, it doesn't really have, it's not a legal term of art, right? Journalists would say that, widespread atrocities were committed in this or that country. It's kind of helpful and not helpful at the same time. It sort of maybe blurs the distinctions between different types of international crimes, right? And one of the things we're going to see is that for international lawyers, it's quite important to distinguish genocide from other international crimes, right? Say, well, yes, in that case, a large number of people were killed, for example, but depending on the circumstances, we might want to describe it as genocide, but maybe it was only a war crime, and maybe it was a crime against humanity. Or maybe it was a combination of all three. Now, this, it might seem a bit mysterious, but I'm trying to explain how. But context is all, right? So just for killing, just to give you an example, if there's a mass shooting, right? 100 people are killed, for example, in the US somewhere because, the person had access to a gun. No, technically 100 people were killed, if it was in another context, it might count as a crime against humanity. If it's in a sort of totally private, ordinary context, it's just mass murder. We wouldn't call it a crime against humanity, right? So, how is, a mass shooting distinct from, let's say, killing 100 Bosnian Muslim soldiers in Srebrenica, right? How, what is the difference? Now, what we're going to see is, I think it depends on a lot of factors, on what the intention was and what the context was and, who the group were. We then get to crimes against humanity. So crimes against humanity is the sort of closest analog to genocide. Does anyone have any idea what a crime against humanity is? I'm not asking for, a legal definition. Yeah. Well, it could be, and that's a really interesting point. So a lot of lawyers would say, not really. So you can have violations of the Geneva Conventions, which are also crimes against humanity, but a crime against humanity might not be a violation of the Geneva Convention. So that's a bit technical, but just to kind of zoom in on that, the Geneva Conventions are part of the laws of war, right? So they prohibit war crimes, okay? So let's say shooting civilians, okay? Now, let's say you're in and, surrounding a city, let's say Sarajevo in 1995, and you're, let's say, occasionally sniping at civilians. That would be a war crime, the war crime of killing civilians, right? But it wouldn't necessarily be a crime against humanity. To make it into a crime against humanity, you would need several elements, but it might not, a crime against humanity might occur outside an armed conflict altogether, in peacetime, right? So if a government just suddenly decides that there's been too many protests in the streets, and they send in the troops with orders to, shoot to kill. 200 people are killed, okay? It's not a war crime because there is no war. It's just demonstrations, there's no armed conflict. But it is, and it's clearly more than mass murder. It's not just there's a quantitative element, a threshold element, which might make it into a crime against humanity. So the official definition in the statute of the International Criminal Court is a kind of long list of acts, including killing, sexual assault, etc., committed as part of a general or systematic attack against the civilian population. Okay? So the state is targeting a civilian population, so they're not military, right? Which makes a big difference. If they were military, actually, soldiers are allowed to shoot each other without incurring criminal responsibility, right? But if you're shooting civilians, harming civilians, especially outside an armed conflict, and doing so in a generalized or systematic way, right? So this isn't just some soldier who decided he had enough and, opened fire on a crowd, right? It's a generalized or systematic. It's happening in different places at the same time. Orders are coming from high up, right? Now, this is interesting because it gets us into why we have international crimes, right? International crimes are different from domestic crimes. They're not just private crimes. They're not just, committed by psychopaths or gangs or, sort of random criminals. They have a sort of collective, public, political element quite often, right? Where does that violence come from? Well, most often it comes from states, traditionally, right? In the 20th century, you think of a sort of great totalitarian or authoritarian regimes that have engaged in violence against civilians. It's the state. why is the state the most likely candidate for committing these sort of mass international crimes? What does the state have? Power and weapons, right? The state has theoretically the monopoly on the use of legitimate violence, but of course, once you have access to the means of violence, that's unfortunately no guarantee that you'll use them in a legitimate way. And so historically, the ability to concentrate weapons, the know-how that comes with using them, state agents, including the military, including the police, who sort of, obey you blindly, that's a big, advantage, as it were, if what you want to do is target civilians. And as we know, states have often done this. Now, this does not mean that a non-state group cannot commit international crimes as well. And we have examples in Cambodia, in Iraq and Syria with Daesh, but many groups, rebel groups, armed groups, have historically managed to concentrate enough power and violence in their hands that they have had the ability to carry out some of these crimes. But I would say that historically, there's a kind of emphasis on the state. Think of Nuremberg, we're not prosecuting, a sort of a gang or sort of a mafia or an armed group. We are prosecuting very much sort of the German Reich, right? The state, and with all of that involves. Okay. Maybe ethnic cleansing. So ethnic cleansing is a popular journalistic term. It describes a particular tactic, right? What's ethnic cleansing? What is it specifically compared to crimes against humanity? Yep. Well, sort of, but that's a bit too broad because, you could be discriminating against a certain group in your country, so you're engaging in a political attack, but you're not, engaging in ethnic cleansing. So there's something a little more specific. Can you imagine? Yeah. Yeah, so the displacement is the key, right? So ethnic cleansing is actually a modality of committing international crimes that really links a certain population to a territory, right? And what you're doing is you're basically kicking out that population from a certain territory where they've often lived for a long time, etc., right? So you're dissociating the group from the territory, typically for the purposes of, creating a sort of your own state or your own, ethnically homogeneous, pure territorial entity, okay? So now that's a frequent modality of crimes against humanity. It's a tactic, it's a technique. Is it, but it's not necessarily genocide. It's not necessarily exactly the same thing. Maybe it's sort of more of a sign that genocide is imminent. But there's a whole debate on this, right? And as we'll see, the debate, it relates to the fact that genocide, really the key to genocide is the destruction of a group, right? So that raises an interesting question. Do you destroy a group merely by virtue of pushing that group outside of its territory? Right? It's an interesting question, right? I mean, just trying to imagine, right? If you were sort of pushed out of Quebec as a group, what would that do to your identity, to sort of the sense of group identity? Maybe some groups might be more affected by this than others. Some groups might have more of a territorial identity, etc., right? So now, remember that in all of this conversation, it's really important to bear in mind that simply because something isn't genocide doesn't mean it can't be one of these other really grave things as well, right? And so, because, quite often in the conversation, there's politically, there's a sort of a big push to describe a lot of things as genocide, which are not really genocide. But simply because they're, crimes against humanity doesn't really make them less grave. They're still something we should be totally scandalized about and worried about and concerned. Okay, so And then so there's apartheid. Apartheid is interesting. What does apartheid share with genocide? If you think of, what does it share with genocide and what does it not share with genocide? If you think of South Africa in the 1970s and 80s, Yeah, so what it shares with genocide is the element of being targeted at a particular group in a sort of discriminatory fashion, right? Apartheid is based on, isolating the sort of a black African population in South Africa. It is not necessarily based on destroying that group as such, right? So in that, it's not really genocide. It's a different thing. It's a sort of fundamentally discriminatory political arrangement that has sort of groups live on different territories. Very bad. Today considered a crime against humanity, right? So there's no, but not quite the same thing as genocide, right? If words have meaning and we try to keep a sense of these distinctions. All right, so I mentioned this already, but there is this tension between popular and legal definitions, right? So historians will debate, for example, I'll give you an example. Historians will debate whether the Armenian genocide was genocide, right? I happen to think that it was under historians' definition. In law, why is it difficult to argue that the Armenian genocide was a genocide under international law? Yep. So we could have that debate, which is also a historical debate, which is sort of, well, was it really an attempt to destroy them or just ethnic cleansing? Yeah. Okay, so again, that would be both a historian's debate and a lawyer's debate. Lawyers would engage that debate as well. They'd say, if it's a war, it's not the same thing. War crimes may have been committed, very bad, but that's not the same thing as saying that genocide occurred. But really, the decisive factor is that the Genocide Convention did not exist at the time when the genocide was committed, right? So it was only adopted, 30, 40 years later. From a lawyer's point of view, that's completely decisive, right? You cannot violate a law that didn't exist at the time, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, that there is anything, defensible about it, or that in a broader sense, it isn't genocide. It is, except if it didn't have that legal label at the time, it couldn't really quite be described as genocide. And it's a great misfortune of the Armenians and Herero and others before them that, they were the target of massacres at a time when the international community didn't really have a vocabulary to describe what had happened to them, right? So I think that's sort of fairly important. So you know why, yeah.
Holocaust also occurred prior to the convention.
Totally.
So would there be any debate about whether or not that was genocide?
There was no debate after the Second World War at Nuremberg because the question was not raised, right? So it is a non-question at the time of Nuremberg, right? Lemkin, himself, a Jew exile in the US who has devoted his life to, condemning what he describes in his mind and increasingly in his writings as genocide, hasn't gotten that message across yet, right? This really only occurs after Nuremberg, right? So the only thing I'm saying is, from a legal point of view, it's nonsensical to have a conversation about a term that, an offense, a criminal offense that doesn't exist, right? And the Nuremberg tribunals was already kind of on very thin ice when it prosecuted crimes against peace. There was no treaty on crimes against peace before the war. There was no treaty or even customary international law on crimes against humanity. I mean, that's a bit debated. But, simply because Western powers in the 19th century had sort of condemned, massacres in Bulgaria as shocking the conscience of mankind wasn't quite the same thing as finding that individuals could be answerable under international criminal law directly, right? So, of course, this is a moot question now, right? We live in an age of genocide, so that door has been closed. It's now, and by the way, the Genocide Convention has been ratified by every single state in the international community, right? So you cannot opt out. In fact, you cannot even denounce the Genocide Convention. You can say, oh, I have, regrets, I think actually I want to de-ratify it. No, it's now completely part of customary international law, right? So it applies whether you agree to it or not as a state. So I think, I just maybe wanted to mention some of the perverse effects that we have around that definition. As soon as the definition exists, and as soon as something is being described as sort of a crime of crimes, everyone, I think understandably, who has an important cause, who feels that they're being persecuted, is going to describe their suffering in the language of genocide, right? So we have this whole debate, for example, in relation to Darfur for over a decade, was genocide going on in Darfur? And people have different views, and we'll get into some of these controversies. The regime killed a lot, but did it really want to destroy the group as such? Are they really an ethnic group, etc.? And the more you have these debates, the more you're distracting, potentially, from what is really the key question, which is not, is this a crime against humanity or is this genocide, but are people needlessly dying who we should be rescuing, as a matter of first priority, right? So yes, there is a stake to describing something as genocide because there's something, there's a special place in hell for people who set out to destroy an entire group, but there's, all kinds of, spots there reserved for people who just randomly kill civilians, or target a group with no particular intent to destroy the group as such, just because they happen to hate all members of that group, right? So, the requirements of genocide, as we're going to see in a minute, are quite onerous, and you want to be careful not to get too caught up in these controversies about, oh, this is genocide, this isn't genocide, etc., because really the threshold to care and to intervene and to do something about what's going on is much lower, right? I mean, just ordinary human rights violations should be of concern. Okay. Okay, so we're going to look at the definition. Now, I don't know, have you already done this a bit, the sort of actual legal definition of genocide? Raise your hand if you have. Nope. I'll take that as a subtle no. All right, so we're going to look at that definition in a bit more detail. It's actually remarkably concise. It was the object of a lot of negotiation, right? So these crimes, they don't, it's a bit like murder in domestic law. When you think, well, murder, that's very easy. We all know what murder is. Actually, murder can be quite complicated, right? There's, if you just lent the knife that was used in a bank robbery where someone was killed, is that murder? Is that, if you knew that someone might get killed, different systems have different views on this, right? If you blanked out at the moment of striking with a knife, there's all kinds of issues that come up, right? Do you have, if a person, you stab someone and they die only a year later from medical complications, did you still kill that person? Or, is the bad medical treatment that they received in the meantime the actual cause, right? So murder is complicated. Now think of that multiplied by, hundreds of times and you have genocide, right? Very contentious. The other reason why genocide is contentious is it's an international offense, right? So domestically, how do we decide what's a crime? Who decides? In Canada, for example. Yes? Yeah. So we have Parliament. That's kind of handy, right? Parliament adopts the criminal code. They have debate, organize, they meet all the time, they have committees, reports, etc. We don't have that degree of institutionalization and centralization in the international community, right? So, states organize diplomatic conferences. They're typically short-lived, last a few weeks at best. And then there's another dimension, which is, domestically, we kind of all live under the same roof, right? And we sort of live in Canada, there's a sovereign, it's pretty clear that someone is deciding for us, via democratic arrangements. Internationally, there's no one above you, right? Everyone is an equal. Every state is equal. The UN isn't above the states, right? It's just a creature of states. And so imagine having to, come up with a definition of an international offense in a system where you can't just rely on some kind of parliamentary majority, right? It's not like 51% of members of parliament voted for this, so that's the law. That's not the way it works. You kind of need everyone to agree, especially if you're creating the crime among crimes, right? So, and remember, everyone is suspicious of everyone. Domestically, we might be a little suspicious of each other, but not as much as states are within international society. So states are going to be, well, oh, I see where this is going, right? So you want to define genocide in that way so it comes back to haunt me, so you can sort of, stigmatize me in international fora, etc., right? So every state is pursuing its national interest, and it's going to want to have a definition of genocide that most protects its interests, right? So states are constantly calculating the odds, right? They're thinking, okay, really, I want this, I'm fine with this, but as long as it's about prosecuting the others, right? I don't want this to come back and haunt me, okay? Let's look at the definition for a second. Genocide means any of the following acts. So you're going to have a list of acts, but the key is these acts have to be committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups as such. So as often with these international treaties, every word counts, right? Like every word has been negotiated with a lot of care. So what are the most, in only that first sentence, what do you think are the most important words? Yeah. Yeah, in whole or in part might be kind of important. I think the idea there was, if you decide that you're going to, kill all the Muslim men in Srebrenica in 1995, rather than necessarily all Muslims in Bosnia, that could still be genocide, right? Because 8,000 people, so sort of a, maybe incomplete genocide, but it's still a genocide, right? Yeah. Yes. And intent is a weird one because, for a lot of crimes you'd think, well, the most important thing is what you actually do, not what was going on in your mind. Actually, that's not true. Think of homicides, right? So if you kill someone, you might kill someone and legally do 0 day in jail or spend the rest of your life in prison, right? What makes the difference? Yeah. And more generally, sorry? And more generally, what's going on in your brain at the moment you did the killing, right? You could kill someone just because you tripped, you fell on that person, they fell, hit their head, they're killed. You killed that person. Causally, right? You killed that person. Totally innocent. Accidents happen. No one's going to jail because they just accidentally killed someone, right? Now, completely different if for 3 months I've been plotting to kill someone and have, a whole plan and, right? But different also if I've been negligent, right? If I've been driving whilst texting. I'm sure no one would ever do this here, but, that would be manslaughter, and that would come with a particular conviction, right? You could spend years in jail for that. So the mental state is actually really important also to domestic offenses, and it really is for genocide as well. Now, do note that it says you have to commit the acts, right? Because if all that was going on was you were sort of daydreaming, sorry, I'm just using an image, right, about killing an entire group but not doing anything, there is no thought crime, right? We wouldn't want people to have these thoughts, But if you never acted upon your thoughts, right, you know, it wouldn't be a crime. Anyhow, we wouldn't know, right? We can't read your brain, okay? So there has to be an act, but really the key is that not only do you have the intent to commit the act, right? So if you're murdering someone, you're actually murdering someone, but you have a special intent, which is that as you're doing it because you want to destroy the group as such, okay? Right? So that's very important. That, you know, this is a crime that is based on people sort of conceptualizing that they want a certain group being eradicated from the face of the earth. And that's where the special nastiness, the special evil of genocide arises, right? It's bad enough to sort of, maybe in a war as part of a campaign of repression, to kill a lot of people, right? But we have a kind of special contempt for people who set out to destroy groups. Why? Because we think that groups are really a key part of the human experience, right? In killing a group, you're killing humanity, right? You're killing, because, you know, that's what we do, right? We are both humans, bare humans who sort of, you know, breathe and need food and etc. But we're also social creatures. And, you know, typically most of us can't be in constant interaction with 6 billion other people, right? We typically have, like, one of our needs is to have a group. It could be the family, it could be our friends, it could be our ethnic group, it could be our religious group, etc. But, you know, one of the twists is, even if we don't think of ourselves as members of that group, but the other that's targeting us thinks, well, you're one of them, you're part of a group. We're still entitled to our protection, right, as members of that group, right? Okay, so here are the acts. We don't need to go in the detail, but you'll see that killing is only one of the things that you can do, right? And look at C. C is quite interesting. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Right? So imagine, what would that be? If it's, yeah. So there could be, you know, just putting people in the ghettos or sort of apartheid, you know, in the Bantustan might not quite be enough to bring about the, but that combined with something else might. I mean, it depends what ghetto. I mean, if the idea of a ghetto is when it's completely starved for food and there's, you know, there's diseases, etc., then it could be a very close analog to actually, you know, sending people, you know, people before a firing squad, or it's almost the same thing, right? So that's interesting. If you think of the 20th century, some of the great famines that have occurred, you know, in Soviet Russia, for example, in Ukraine, possibly even in China. You know, if you really know that having this policy, and you have the evidence coming in, right? That this policy is killing a lot of people, and you know, with the added dimension that they belong to a group, then you can't, you know, it's, you know, you probably have the intent to destroy that group as such. Now, what about the group? What is interesting about the definition? It's not much of a definition. What can you tell me about the groups that are protected? Yeah. No, it wouldn't. And it's not entirely surprising. This wasn't on top of, you know, the agenda of the men who met in sort of 1948. They were all men. And just this, you know, this was the furthest thing from their mind. This was a very different time. Yeah. In terms of protected groups, it is. That hasn't prevented civil society, activists, scholars, even some states from saying, we need to open it up, right? Because one of the problems is it's great to protect some groups, but what about the groups that are excluded? What about the blind spots of a Genocide Convention? This is where you see that, you know, an instrument of justice can carry, you know, its own injustice, right? Because it's kind of foregrounding the protection of certain groups at the expense of others. Now, what I can tell you as a sort of international lawyer is this is a dilemma that arises quite often. because a lot of human rights treaties, for example, would need to be updated in light of evolving conditions and dominant social conceptions, etc. The problem is, quite often, if you have something that has become a bit sacred, that has become really binding, you're really scared that if you reopen the negotiations, the whole thing might crumble, right? That some state is going to say, oh, but I don't think ethnic or racial groups should be protected. So you're going to create a lot of indeterminacy, right? So the challenge for lawyers is how do you kind of maybe make the categories evolve from within, or what are your alternative strategies, right? There's no doubt that if a state or a group had a systematic policy of targeting women or members of the LGBTQ community, that could quite easily be described as a crime against humanity, right? Crimes against humanity, I didn't give you the whole definition, but has persecution of certain groups as one of the ways in which you would commit a crime against humanity. In terms, by the way, of a kind of sentencing regimen, for individuals who commit either crimes against humanity or genocide, it's really the same. Like, you could easily spend your life behind bars in both cases, right? So for victims, in terms of their sentiment of getting justice, I think that would be a big part of what you can get from these prohibitions. However, they may still object to the fact that the stigma of crimes against humanity, at least in their mind, is not quite the same thing as the stigma of genocide. And after all, why should groups that actually exist and are actually persecuted and that some people want to destroy as such not be protected? Okay? So I think it's a really good point. What else is excluded? What would be an obvious example? If you think of, the Soviet sort of, nationalizations and sort of repression of the kulaks, or if you think of repression in South America in the 70s and 80s, or even Cambodia, the killing fields of Cambodia. Political groups, right? Quite often, so Argentina and Chile, anyone from Argentina and Chile originally? Anyone has connections? So, think of Pinochet, think of Videla. Who are they persecuting? Like, are they trying to, they killed 3,000 maybe in the case of Chile, 30,000 in the case of Argentina. Is there a genocide, right? Well, not really, because they're targeting leftists, right? They're targeting the Monteneros, they're targeting groups that they oppose politically, but the Argentines killing Argentines, Chileans killing Chileans doesn't really make sense to say that they're trying to destroy the national group of Chileans as such. Of course they're not. They're Chileans themselves, right? So it doesn't really fit, right? Now, again, it could be crime against humanity, it could be human rights violations. It's not quite genocide. And in fact, so the question arises with Cambodia as well, right? In Cambodia, you have a small group of Cambodians killing a lot, and I mean really a lot, of Cambodians. They're not trying to destroy the Cambodian group, national group as such. That wouldn't make any sense, right? They're trying to kill, liberal, westernized, bourgeois Cambodians. That's a kind of political group. It's a sort of amorphous group. Now, by the way, the Soviet Union at the time was the one that the political groups being protected was on the agenda. It was in the initial proposal, and the Soviets said, we see where this is going. This is going to come back and haunt us. We don't want political groups to be protected groups as such. Okay. So there's ambiguities, like all definitions. I mean, one of the issues is, so no genocide, luckily, has ever been sort of fully perfected, although, well, maybe some indigenous groups, arguably, right? But clearly, killing every single member of the group cannot be a necessary condition of genocide being committed, right? But if you're just a racist and you kill one person of the group, and if you had the means, you wouldn't mind killing the whole group. That can't quite be genocide either, right? I mean, there has to be a certain credibility to your sort of genocidal plan, right? So there's kind of that intermediate category where it's not absolutely clear, how many you need to kill or destroy, or how far you really need to go for it to be genocide. I realize it's a bit of an awkward conversation to have. Most of the time it'll be fairly obvious, but sometimes it will be a question. Now, how does one go about destroying a group? Based on that definition or anything else that you may know from history or just your general interest? Because it's actually interesting, right? We know how you kill someone, right? We have a fairly good idea of that. But how do you destroy a group? How might you do that? Give me examples. Yep? Yeah. So I think that's really important, right? I mean, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, right? It's a bit ambiguous, right? Is the fact that you cannot speak your language, does that bring about your physical destruction? Well, I'm not sure. What is the physical existence of a group, right? I think it means that the members of a group are alive, but it probably means that they are sort of, physically or at least socially existent as a group, right? But certainly you could imagine, like languages are really important to us. Belief systems are really important to us. If you cannot engage your beliefs, if you cannot live your group life in a pretty radical way, right? Then you might be the target of a genocide. I'm saying in a pretty radical way, right? Because every issue of minority discrimination cannot be an issue of genocide. Right? There's a lot of discrimination, including in Canada. There are different languages you can deploy, right? The language of discrimination under human rights, right? The language of social justice, etc. It doesn't have to be genocide. For it to be genocide, there has to be an element of the denial of a discrimination being so bad that it brings about the physical destruction of a group. But these conversations are open, right? And we want to have them open and ongoing. What else have génocidaires done that maybe wasn't recognized so much in 1948? Anyone know a bit about Rwanda, the genocide there? Or Bosnia? Gender was mentioned earlier on, so I think it has actually a connection. And in fact, the gender dimension has come back. So not as necessarily as gendercide or feminicide, although scholars are talking about this, but there is a way in which sex and gender can be an important part of genocidal projects as, against national, ethnical, racial groups. How? Yep. So there's an element of that, so that's a good point, right? So if you prevent births, if you sterilize the woman of a certain group, you're sending a very strong signal. You actually literally want the group to not physically prosper, right? And this is, of course, an individual rights violation, but it's also very much targeted at the group, right? Groups need to reproduce themselves, right? If they can't do that, they are being destroyed. Yeah? Yeah, I think that's interesting. So, I mean, one of the tricky bits in all of this, and we're going to get into that in a second, is ethnic and racial groups are pretty fluid notions, right? And so much so that, famously the Nazis had to develop these sort of super complex laws to decide who was really Jewish, right? I mean, how many great-grandparents needed to be Jewish for you to qualify as a Jew for purposes of the Nuremberg laws? And then there were people who were Jews but had served in the First World War and blah, blah. So with the Rwandans were kind of lost themselves with that Tutsi-Hutu distinction, right? And so they had, it wasn't clear because there was a lot of intermarriage. Same thing in Sarajevo, Muslims married to Orthodox. If you're half-half, what are you, right? So that whole sort of mixity and just complexity, right? What if you're sort of Jewish but you don't identify as Jewish, you're not practicing, or, same thing with sort of a secularized Muslim in Sarajevo, are you part of a religious group or are you not? It's not clear, right? So you are going to have that element which is connected to gender, actually, in complex ways. For example, because, it might be that it's inherited, whether, belonging to the religion or the ethnic group is sort of inherited from the mother, right? And that brings me to, I think, an element which is really important, which was important in both Bosnia and Rwanda, which is sort of the great genocides or crimes against humanity of our era, was the element of sexual violence, right? So in particular rape. So a concerted campaign of rape of Bosnian women, of Tutsi women, and here, as you can see, you have a complexity, right? So first, it's a kind of an affront of the dignity of a group. You sort of, so you target the woman. Now, the group can then, in its own reaction to the sexual assault, sort of contribute to its own destruction by maybe shunning victims of sexual assault. And then there's the children that are born from these rapes, right? Now, in Rwanda, for example, the ethnicity is dependent on your father. Okay? So if a Hutu man were to rape a Tutsi woman, and that woman then has a child, that child is Hutu, right? The ethnicity of the Tutsi ethnicity in that case cannot be transmitted. Okay? So I mention this because it wasn't, it wasn't foregrounded at Nuremberg, although, for example, the Japanese in the Far East, is a mass campaign of sexual assault, and that was really part of it. So even though the targeting of a particular gender as such is not, under the official definition of genocide, considered a form of genocide, there's a lot of intersectionality going on, right? The same way we would expect, intersectionality to happen at the individual level, it happens at group level. So people are, gender and race and ethnicity kind of overlap and can become targets in some of these campaigns. Okay. And I'm realizing that about 15 minutes. So so the biggest stake, right, in all of this is determining when genocide has occurred or not. Now, ideally, you want to do this before the genocide has been committed. That's the biggest challenge of prevention, right? It's better than nothing to prosecute crimes of genocide after the fact, but really what we want to do, the real prize is avoiding the commission of genocides in the first place. So for that, we need to use these legal definitions, not just as lawyers would. What do lawyers do typically? They arrive after the facts, right? If you ever need to recruit a lawyer, it's probably that it's a bit too late, okay? You're already sitting in a cell somewhere if it's a crime. Lawyers are, not typically consulted, before the crime is committed, although they might be in some cases. They're not very good at prevention, right? But with genocide, it's a bit like murder. These are crimes that we cannot afford to be committed. This isn't business as usual, right? We can't, it doesn't matter, we'll sentence them in due course if we find them to be guilty, right? We actually don't want the crime to happen. But for lawyers, that requires a sort of different set of mind where you anticipate. You see things coming, right? So you detect the acts of preparation, right? Maybe even before the attempt, right? In the criminal law in Canada, we have a notion of attempt, right, or conspiracy. These are sort of inchoate crimes. These are crimes that were not fully committed, where the police, is eavesdropping and maybe sort of can break the conspiracy before it puts its criminal plan in action. That's ideal. That doesn't happen very often. And one of the reasons it doesn't happen very often domestically is, first, it's very hard to sort of be eavesdropping just at that moment. But often the lawyers are saying, no, let's wait a bit longer until they commit the offense, because then we can really sort of get them on right? And if you intervene too early, you might not have much of a case against them, right? So there's a delicate balance. And I think with genocide, it's the same thing. I think the problem of the international community has often been that it has intervened too late. But you could also intervene too early, like, yeah. Yeah. You always do. But you can crack a lot of eggs and still not do an omelette. It's sort of so I think, but yeah, you need to deploy resources. But remember, there's always opportunity costs, right? So let's say you're focusing, the UN decides to focus on one region. you know, what else is it neglecting at the same time, right? And what kind of matrix do we use to understand, you know, it's hard enough to understand what genocide is. Now think that you're a few steps back and you're, you know, trying to see the early onset of a kind of slowly unfolding genocide, right? And remember that states and groups are not going to take this sort of, you know, lying down. Think of Burma, Myanmar, and the Rohingya. You know, the government there is really like strongly, or Darfur and Sudan, they're really arguing, you've got this completely wrong, right? No, this isn't genocide. You don't understand. You're not from the region. You know, it's not about, no, these are people who are fleeing voluntarily, and yes, there may have been a few excesses, but we're on it, don't worry. This isn't your problem. You know, what do you know, etc., right? So no one is saying, you know, is waiting for the International Commission of Inquiry to arrive and say, sorry, you know, you're in the early stages of genocide. There's going to be significant pushback, okay? And by the way, preventing is an unglamorous business. People want to work, a lot of my students want to work for the International Criminal Court. They want to be in the courtroom when Karadzic or, you know, Laurent Gbagbo or al-Bashir get prosecuted. They want that moment of drama, etc. If you're in genocide prevention, you know, no one gives you much credit for the campaigns of extermination that never occurred, because people are like, yeah, well, you know, who knows? Maybe you stopped it. Maybe it just, maybe there was never anything there to be seen, right? So it's a bit like preventing crime domestically. The ordinary day-to-day kind of social welfare work that is involved in, you know, stopping people from engaging in crime is extremely rewarding at some level, but doesn't, you know, put you in that position where you're sort of, you know, you get to embody justice and point society's finger at someone. All right, so there's, you know, legal challenges, whether there was an intent. Very simple question. How do you prove that someone wanted to destroy the group as such, right? Most people, unless you're some kind of caricature Nazi, or even the Nazis sort of, you know, try to hide their tracks, right? If we didn't have the minutes of a, you know, Swansea meeting, we wouldn't know that this was really what was planned, right? So in Rwanda, it was kind of, sure, there was hatred. Yeah, maybe songs on the radio that were pretty racist against the Tutsi. But no one was saying, you know, okay, here are your marching orders. We're going to destroy the Tutsi group as such, right? So you have to infer this from what's going on, the whole context. And that can be tricky, right? So partly the context might be, well, no one kills 500,000 members of a group if they don't actually intend to destroy the group as such, right? It's not random, like it doesn't, right? So they probably wanted to destroy the group because they killed so many. And we'll have, you know, writings by ideologues, but you need to show that the person who is being accused, not someone else, actually had that intent. What did they know? Maybe they just, you know, living in their village in, you know, outside Kigali thinking, hey, I'm going to take revenge against my Tutsi neighbor because, you know, he has a bigger farm than I do, right? You know, just because they might just be opportunistic murderers rather than a génocidaire. Yeah. Yeah. Totally, and that gets us to the question of prevention, right? So how do we prevent, right? And suspicious deliveries, you know, of weapons would be an indication that something is at work. But, you know, in terms of proving the intent, someone maybe had the intent. But people can fool even themselves, right? So people will think, well, I don't think anyone in Rwanda, I don't know this for sure, I don't think in the Hutu government, I don't think everyone was saying, you know, cabinet meeting, okay, we're going to commit genocide, right? It was always masquerading both for possible outside consumption, but also for internal consumption. We are going to defend the country against these rebels who have all these local Tutsi allies because this is our sovereignty and these Tutsis have dominated us for long enough. No one is saying we're going to commit genocide, right? It's not, it amounts to the same thing, and you don't have to call it genocide, and you don't have to sort of have, you know, that sort of word materialize in your mind to be committing genocide, right? If you actually objectively had decided to destroy the group as such, we don't care what your motivations are, right? And this is a very sort of criminal law thing, right? Murder is murder regardless of your motive for committing it, right? We try to, like, you know, because these are rules that we feel very strongly about. You know, we're not going to say, well, that's murder, you know, for gain, that's murder for out of passion. It's not the same thing. Murder is murder. You don't kill people. Same thing with genocide, right? You don't destroy a whole group regardless of your motive. We're frankly not that interested in your motive, right? We just don't, like, we're not interested because, you know, there cannot be a good motive for for destroying a whole group, right? So it's just conversation over. All right, so there's going to be evidentiary issues because people cover their tracks. And one of the things that was helpful with prosecuting Nazis is, you know, we had the whole German state, right? And so they kind of, you know, they were typing away and they had memos and, you know, there was a lot of evidence, like a treasure troves of evidence which the Allies found. But in other contexts, there's just not that much in writing. So then you're basically relying on oral testimony. Someone, you know, from the in-group sort of saying, yeah, that's kind of the order I remember being given. People's memory failed them. It's going to be a bit hard to prove. And that's assuming you can find someone who wants to testify, right? And you know, not risk indicting themselves in the process. Most people are going to say, no, nothing ever happened. You look at the Rwanda tribunal. Almost all defendants without a fault were in complete denial. No, you don't understand. This never happened. It was a war. We were at war, etc. The world is against us. It's all rigged. It's just, you know, Western powers, etc., etc. All right, I'm not going to go into the details here, but I just wanted to show that this is a bit contentious. And it does lead to these weird things. So in Cambodia, 1 million people were killed, for example, right, in the killing fields, but most of them were not killed as part of a genocide. It's only the killing of a Vietnamese minority and the Cham's ethnic group in Cambodia that was described by the Cambodian courts as genocide. Everything else was crimes against humanity, but it's not genocide. Because, you know, the Khmer Rouge couldn't possibly have wanted to target the Cambodian national group because they were part of it. And there's a lot of, so one of the questions is who decides, right? It's really key in the international community. Domestically, it's pretty clear, right? I mean, we have trials, we have prosecutions. If we have a verdict, and the verdict, you know, if a jury, for example, says it was murder, that's who decides. And we kind of agree to that in advance. Internationally, we haven't agreed to any particular procedure. So it's all very ad hoc, very improvised, and quite difficult to sort of put your finger on, and of course, extremely politicized. Now, the UN has a key role. Civil society sometimes has kind of overtaken the UN, creating its own commissions of inquiry. But remember, you know, everyone has their allies. People are going to be, you know, Darfur is a good example. Sudan has a lot of allies at the UN and kind of mobilize them to deny that anything was amiss. Now, I'm going to conclude, because I'm running out of time. Detection, early warning is really what a lot of this conversation is about. And maybe I just want to, you know, we have our stages, right? You know, the Nuremberg laws kind of preceded the Holocaust by sort of at least a decade, right? So there's a slow sort of, you know, putting of things in place. What I just want to suggest is that it's easier with the benefit of hindsight to recognize a genocide, right? Now, we recognize that, you know, hundreds of thousands of Armenians were killed, you know, by the Ottoman Empire, by the Young Turks, as part of a systematic campaign with which, having seen all the evidence and, you know, 50, 100 years later, we see was definitely a genocide. But imagine you're an Ottoman soldier, you know, or a Turkish soldier at the time. You're just, you know, you're just marching, you're receiving orders, you have no idea where you are, you just get a mission on the day. You know, you don't necessarily have a big picture, right? You don't know. Like, you've just been told that these people are attacking, you know, your group. And so the same thing, you know, could be true in other circumstances that let's say it's easier from outside or with the benefit of hindsight to know what is going on. And sometimes that genocide-war distinction it's very tricky, right? And it's this classic, in Sudan, there's making the same argument that the Turks have been making, that, well, not, it's really a war. You don't understand what's going on. It's equal to equal. We're not trying to destroy the group as such. And even the modern Turkish state is kind of, saying, look, it's complicated. We recognize that people were killed who probably shouldn't have been killed. But you have to understand this was very complicated. There were armed bands in Anatolia. The Armenians were sort of rising against us, blah, blah, right? So genocide is premised on a fairly clear, simple, this group wanted to, or these people wanted to destroy the group as such, right? And the other side is going to try to make everything much more untidy, much more complex. All right. And then, prevention goes all the way to intervention. So it's one thing to raise alarms, and I mentioned whistleblowers. That, Dallaire knew what was going on because someone within the Hutu elite had actually, there's this famous informer who said, look, something like you really ought to know about this. This was a few weeks before the genocide. No one really knew, most genocides are prepared in secret. Right? If you have someone who breaks rank and comes to report on the impending genocide, that can be a lot of help. But you have to believe these people. I mean, not every Jew who managed to escape or sort of send photos to Switzerland or the Allies was taken seriously, right? And the case of the United Nations itself in Rwanda, they had troops. They could have done more, right? To its sort of endless shame, I suppose, but they didn't have the courage. There's also this sense that, well, this can't possibly be true, right? It can't be that bad, right? Because it just seems so enormous that, that would be the plan, to destroy an entire group. But, and then down the road, when it's too late, when you haven't prevented. Because, prevention is so broad, right? At a certain level, prevention just means having democratic, inclusive, pluralistic societies founded on the rule of law where no minority is persecuted, right? That's a pretty tall program. If you want to not have a genocide, that's what you do, but that's kind of what we're always doing all the time. So prevention of genocide is not very distinctive. It's not very specific. It's sort of just making society safer in general, right? So, but, at one point it's too late. Like genocide is, if this is serious now, this isn't just discrimination that could become genocide, people are dying, and then there's this question that and I'm happy to take questions on this. What do you do then? Do you send in the troops? What if sending in the troops makes things worse? What's your authority to intervene in another country because people are being killed there? How will you avoid being seen to take sides? Do you need to overthrow the government? Do you have a Security Council mandate? All these questions are being asked, and I think they're being asked with sort of increased intensity in this day and age. So thank you very much for your patience. Sorry for taking a bit longer. Thank you.
I think we pretty much run out of time, but if anybody has a quick question.
So in your presentation, you covered the ways and the understanding of how a genocide works and functions from sort of before and after a genocide happens. So we're able to discuss how does it work, why does it work, and so on. But getting to prevention, and then you go to peacekeeping and civilian protection, how do we get to that step and establish that as genocides are going on right now, how do you get past that minutia of, is this a genocide going on, and you have the defenders saying it's not going on?
Yeah.
How do you get to the step of we can stop it now when a genocide is going on, say in Israel or in Palestine as well?
Okay. So I'm going to be very concrete. So in the international community, you need to get your authority from somewhere, right? And you can do things unilaterally, as an individual, as a state. That's always a possibility, but it's not ideal because you're on your own, and every other state is going to point to the fact that, well, you probably have your own interests for doing this. Although unilateral intervention isn't impossible, right? Vietnam intervened in Cambodia towards the end of the Khmer Rouge regime, effectively bringing the genocide to a halt. No one is complaining today. No one's saying, oh, Vietnam violated Cambodian sovereignty. It was sort of fairly well accepted. Tanzania invading Uganda, under Idi Amin. There's a few examples of this, a sort of unilateral humanitarian intervention where no one was really shedding tears. But ideally, you need Security Council authorization, right? Otherwise, it could be construed as aggression. You're not actually supposed to use force against another state. That's one of the big taboos of the international legal order, right? So on the one hand, things have reached a bit of a boiling point. On the one hand, we're being told you need to stop genocide in its tracks, even if it means using force, because it's really, really bad. And on the other hand, international lawyers have been telling us for 50 years, don't use force against another state. That's aggression. That's a crime against peace. So, how do you square that? And that is really what's being negotiated through the whole idea of responsibility to protect, etc. But as you know, this is, it's very tricky, right? And the Security Council will do what it will do, right? I mean, this is a political body. It's an executive body. It's not a court. They can do things, right? One of the things that they can do is if they get support, they can at least, for example, create a commission of inquiry, right? But let's at least have a few independent people go on the ground and come back and report to us. In some ways, it's a stalling and deferring tactic. In some ways, it's better than having the Security Council members, for their own political reasons, decide that something is genocide or not. And we have the International Criminal Court now. And of course, if the International Criminal Court returns a verdict of, this individual committed genocide, that's a pretty clear sign that a few people around him must have committed genocide as well. And that would reinforce the hand of those who say, well, we need to be doing more. But typically, the International Criminal Court, tends to prosecute people sort of 5-10 years after the fact. So that criminal logic is, not preventive of the genocides it's prosecuting. It might be preventive in a deeper way of future genocides by deterring people from committing genocide by saying, look, you won't get away with it. We will, trace you and we will prosecute you. Okay? But again, if you're in the midst of a kind of life to death sort of political struggle, the idea that maybe 10, 15 years down the road, you might be prosecuted in The Hague, you have a chance in a million, it's not going to deter you much. So I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. But look, I mean, yeah. Well, I'll give you a general answer. So generally, the role of law is to mediate these difficult conversations by providing a language where you can have arguments that are not just